Welcome back to Educator.com. Today we're going to go over the basics of supply and demand. So let's go ahead and dig right into the lecture here. In today's lesson overview, what we're going to do is we're going to describe what a competitive market is and how it is described by the supply and demand model. Again, supply and demand is a very familiar topic in macroeconomics and microeconomics, but we're just going to deal with really the basics of what supply and demand is. And this is going to be an essential building block for some of the more difficult material. So we're going to explain what the demand curve is and what the supply curve is. We'll show the difference between change in quantity demanded versus a change in demand. A lot of people don't really understand this. A lot of students get this concept confused. If you rely on your economics from the mass media, this nuance isn't really going to be emphasized. So one of the things, if you want to pass the AP macro exam, make sure you know the difference between change in quantity demanded versus a change in demand. We're going to determine how to find the equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity. And then finally, what we're going to do is we will graphically illustrate how the price moves from the market back to equilibrium from either a shortage or a surplus. So if the price or the equilibrium point is in disequilibrium, then what's the process by which it's going to go back into equilibrium, whether it's from a surplus or a shortage? So supply and demand. So what exactly is supply and demand? So supply and demand model, it's a model of how competitive markets functions. So this is the idea of whether you're talking about gas prices, whether you're talking about the market for textbooks, whatever it is, supply and demand is usually going to be able to answer, how a market functions. You have sellers that want to make a profit, and you have consumers that want to try to get the most bang for their buck. So you have these contrasting forces, and a free market works when you have sellers and you have consumers, they meet together, right? So what are aspects of this supply and demand model? Well, obviously you have the demand curve, which is downward sloping. And then you have the supply curve, which is upward sloping, because as prices get higher, then there's more of an incentive to get more of a profit, right? So one of the things about this competitive market, we're going to look at the set of factors that cause demand to shift, and then the set of factors that cause the supply curve to shift. So another way of saying, factors that cause shift one way or the other would be, what are the determinants of demand and supply? And so we're going to connect supply and demand together. And when we do so, we're going to find the equilibrium price and quantity. Or another way of looking at it is a market clearing price or a market clearing quantity. So let's take a look first at the demand schedule and demand curve. So you get the demand schedule and the demand curve. So a market demand schedule, what it does is it shows how much of a good or service consumers will want to buy at the different prices. So it's just a relationship between price and quantity. And so you use different prices and see what the quantity would be. Whereas a market demand curve is a graphical representation of the demand schedule. So what we're going to do here, we'll just give a very simple example, is we're going to give what is a market demand for used potato chips and change in quantity demanded, right? So in this case, used potato chips, that's something maybe that I actually intended to say regular potato chips here, but let's go with this here, used potato chips here. There's not going to be maybe a whole lot of demand for it, but just like any good or service, there's going to be as price goes up, quantity demanded goes down, and as price goes down, quantity demanded goes up. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a market demand schedule first for these used potato chips. Probably not going to be very appetizing. Now, if there was no demand at whatever price, there would be no quantity demanded. But let's go ahead and assume that there is a demand for these used potato chips. So let's go ahead and use very simple prices, 25 cents. You have 50 cents. You have 75 cents. this would be $1. And then you have $1.25. Now again, so let's look at the market, the entire market in the United States. So what would the quantity demanded be at 25 cents? And we're creating a hypothetical set of numbers here. So let's go ahead with 100,000. And again, as long as you increase the price, if you increase the price, there's going to be a decrease in quantity demanded. So let's go ahead and put 80,000 right here when the price increases, and then 60,000 right here, and then 40,000, and then 20,000. Now, how is that going to look on a supply and a demand schedule here? Well, you're going to have price right here. You're going to have a price on the y-axis, and you're going to have quantity of potato chips. Again, used potato chips, and you know, you want to put the right labeling here. So we're going by 25 cents. 50 cents, 75 cents, $1, and then $1.25. And then on the labeling on the bottom, we'll go in increments of 20,000. So let's go with 20,000 here, 40,000, 60,000, 80,000, and then 100,000 here. And basically what you're doing is you're just plotting the points at this point. So at 25 cents, you have 100,000 potato chips that are demanded here, and at 80,000 it would be 50, and at 75 cents, I'm sorry, it would be 60,000. At $1, it would be 40,000. And at $1.25, there's only 120,000 that is demanded at that particular price here. So clearly you see a downward sloping demand curve, and you label this as D1 here. So what this represents is, this is the demand curve, and each point represents quantity demanded. So that's basically what you have here. You have the market demand schedule as shown here, and this is the market demand curve. So what would cause a shift in the demand curve versus a change in quantity demanded? So let's go ahead and first look at what would cause a change in the entire demand curve. What would cause it to either shift to the right or to the left? So the first reason that you can kind of come up with is there could be a change in prices of related goods. And there's two different things we're going to look at. We're going to look at substitutes, and then the second is complements. Okay, so substitutes, what you have here is that a fall in the price of one of the goods makes consumers less willing to buy the other goods. So there's a positive correlation. So let's say, for example, that you have two items. Again, very simple example would be you have Coke and you have Pepsi. So let's say the price of Coca-Cola goes down. For some reason, price of Coca-Cola goes down. Then what happens to the demand for Pepsi? Well, the demand for Pepsi also goes down. So you can say that there's a positive correlation. Same thing, if the price of Coke goes up, then the demand for Pepsi goes up. So there's a positive correlation here. So this is going to be like a positive correlation here. Now, one thing that I like to use as an example for my students, if I'm not at school, then obviously there's going to be a substitute in my classroom. And the first reaction I ask students is, if I'm not there, what kind of reaction do you have? Or any other teacher, maybe that assigns a lot of work and you want to relax that day, you have a positive reaction. The teacher's not there, so you have a positive reaction. So same thing in economics. When there's a substitute, if the price goes down, then the price of the substitute also goes down. If the price goes up, then the price of the substitute also goes up. So there's a positive correlation between goods when you're dealing with a change in demand. And again, with complements, it works the opposite way here. So a fall in the price of one of the goods makes consumers more willing to buy the other good. So there's a negative correlation here. So for example, salt and pepper. So let's say the price of salt goes down. What happens to the demand for pepper? Well, the demand for pepper is going to increase, right? Because they're complements. And so kind of similar to the substitute analogy, where if a student's teacher is not there, then the students is going to be pretty excited about that. So there's a positive correlation. Well, this is a little bit of a stretch, but I like using simple mnemonics to try to get you to understand economic concepts. Imagine, for example, that someone gave you a compliment, like, for example, wow, those are nice shoes that you're wearing. Well, you know what? We live in a very cynical world. So chances are that person who just gave you a compliment, chances are that person wants something for you. So I want to associate compliments as having a negative correlation, because if someone gives you a compliment, we live in a cynical world. So you want to, step back and say, whoa, what do you want right here? So there's a negative correlation to that. Okay, so there's a negative correlation, meaning that if the price of salt goes down, then the demand for pepper goes up. Or conversely, if the price of skis go up, then the demand for ski boots go down. So you see how there's a correlation. And again, sometimes you might be asked to test to see, the price of something went up, goes up. What happens to the demand of something? And you're trying to figure out, is it a substitute or a complement? So in terms of in-depth analysis, this is more of a microeconomic situation, but it's good to know, even in macroeconomics, that the idea that substitutes or complements can shift the supply or demand. You're not going to have to really deal with calculations and numbers in the macro course, but you are going to have to know the idea that if the price of a substitute decreases, then the demand for the other substitute is going to also decrease as well. So there's that positive correlation. So there's a positive correlation for substitutes, and there's a negative correlation with complements. Okay, another reason that could shift the demand curve would be changes in income. And there's two different types of goods that are impacted. There's normal goods and there's inferior goods. Very simple. Normal goods can be anything. So a rise in income increases the demand. For example, computers, Disneyland, steak, chicken. 99% of the goods are going to be generally normal goods. Baseball tickets, pens, cameras, whatever it may be. As income rises, so as income increases, then also the demand is going to increase. It's pretty self-explanatory. You get more money, then you're going to want to buy more items at every single price level here. Now, inferior goods actually work in the opposite way. So this is a rise in income actually decreases the demand. So again, there's some goods that are maybe unfairly targeted in economics books. I would say the most common would be mac and cheese and maybe Top Ramen. But this is the idea that if you win the lottery, then your demand for certain items are going to actually decrease. And that's basically what inferior goods are. So if your income increases, then the demand will actually go down for things like macaroni and cheese, Top Ramen, maybe used cars, maybe certain types of used cars, not the case. But also the converse would be actually true. So if your income decreased, so if I got fired from my job and I had no source of income, then the demand for macaroni and cheese and Top Ramen would actually increase. I'd want to feed my family, and with no source of income, maybe my demand for food at the 99-cent store would increase. Very sad situation, but that's basically the way economics works here. Another situation would be a change in tastes. Now, this is a little bit more of a subjective thing, so there's really no in-depth analysis. I mean, really, why do people want what they want? There could be changes due to fad, beliefs, cultural shifts. These are all clumped together under preferences. I think the most common example maybe would be through advertisement. So for example, changes in tastes. During Super Bowl time, a lot of people maybe don't even watch the football game. They want to see if there's a great commercial. And really what commercials are trying to do, it's really trying to change your preference and taste and to try to increase demand for a particular product. So there are a lot of products that maybe have made their name a little bit more known. They've created demand where there was no demand through advertisement. So that's one way that companies can try to create a change in tastes. But the more general term would be under preferences. Another way would be through changes in expectations. So if you expect more income in the future, then demand for certain goods, for example, car or refrigerator, might increase. So this is very similar to the idea of an increase of income leads to an increase in demand. Increase in the expectation of income. So let's say you're projecting that you're going to get a job promotion, or let's say you do, and you're going to get a bonus, then your demand for certain goods, normal goods, is going to increase here. Now, kind of along the same line of thought, if the expectations of a future price drop of items exist, then the demand for these items drop today. So almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy. So what does that mean here? So let's say, for example, let's say hypothetically that you know for a fact, or you anticipate that the price of PlayStation 4s are going to decrease by 50% within the next month. Then what's going to happen to your demand for PlayStations right now at the current price before the drop? It's actually going to decrease. And it's almost kind of like a self-fulfilling prophecy. So we'll talk about the paradox of thrift a little bit later on. But generally in a macroeconomy, this is not good when people expect prices to drop and you have deflation and people hoard onto their money. From a macroeconomic perspective, it's not a good thing. But again, this is a concept, this paradox of thrift, of saving money and maybe for spending later on. Might sound good individually, but there could be macroeconomic ramifications regarding that here. So let's take a look. How would that actually look, an increase in demand on a supply and demand curve here? Let's go ahead and draw this out here. So let's draw this demand curve, D1. And let's put Q here on the bottom and price here on the top. And let's go ahead and draw the supply curve here, and let's label it accordingly here. So this would be the equilibrium quantity. And here's the equilibrium price. When you have a demand shift to the right, then exactly how it sounds, there's an increase in demand or demand shift to the right, a rightward shift here. What ends up happening is that you have an increase in quantity and you have an increase in price. So if there's a demand increase, then what happens is that the equilibrium price goes up and the equilibrium quantity also goes up. So I think this is very straightforward. If something becomes more popular for whatever reason, or if there's an increase in income, then both the equilibrium price and quantity will increase. Now, what would it be if there's a decrease in demand? Again, it's pretty self-explanatory here. You draw the demand curve D1 here, and then you draw the supply curve S1 here. Label this as Q. Label this as P here. And let's go ahead and label this as the equilibrium price, which is Q1 and P1. So if there's a decrease in demand, again, for whatever reason, then this demand curve is going to shift to the left here. And so the equilibrium quantity will decrease and the equilibrium price will also decrease here. So what you end up having is that if there's a decrease in demand, then the price goes down, the equilibrium price here, and the equilibrium quantity also goes down. So those are two very straightforward examples of a demand increase versus a demand decrease. Okay, supply schedule and supply curve. So we've tackled the demand component of it. Let's go ahead and look at the supply side of this all. So a market supply schedule is it shows how much of a good or service that all producers, as opposed to an individual supply schedule, which would be only one producer, will want to sell at different prices. So market supply curve is going to be a graphical representation of the supply schedule. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at the market supply for potato chips and then the resulting change in quantity supplied here. So what we have here is a market supply schedule here. So this is going to be a market supply schedule. And let's go ahead and use very similar prices that we used when we did a market demand schedule for potato chips here. So you have price and you have quantity here. So let's start off with 25 cents, 50 cents, 75 cents, $1, and $1.25 here. And the quantity, let's go ahead and use 20,000, and then 40,000, 60,000, 80,000, and then 100,000. Now again, the numbers I just kind of created out of thin air. So this is a market in a particular area, maybe the United States, although this would be a pretty low estimate here. The only rule of thumb here is that for the law of supply, as prices go up, quantity supplied also goes up here. So as long as you just follow that rule, you know, you're fine with this hypothetical example here. So on the bottom here, I'm going to have increments of 20,000. And this is the quantity of potato chips. And on the price, we're going to go in increments of 25 cents. So 25 cents, and you have 50 cents, 75 cents, $1, and then $1.25 here. So at 25 cents, I did not label the x-axis right here. So this is 20K, 40K, 60K, 80K, and 100,000 here. At 25 cents, it's 20,000. At 50 cents, 40,000 is produced. At 75 cents, more profit potential, so 60,000 bags are produced. At $1, more people jump in, and 80,000. And at $1.25, you have 100,000 here. So what you do is you just connect the dots here and label this as S1. And what you get here is the market supply schedule. So again, this is basic supply and demand. So when you connect these two things together, then you get an equilibrium price and quantity. But this is how you would construct your own market supply schedule, and then your corresponding market supply. Actually, this is not market supply schedule, my mistake. That's the market supply schedule right here. This is a market supply curve. So this is how you would individually construct it using a hypothetical set of data. So what would cause the shifts in the supply curve? So we examined some of the different things, changes in income, changes in preferences that would shift the demand curve. Well, what would cause a shift in the supply curve here? The first thing would be change in input prices. Another would be changes in technology, and then another would be changes in expectations. So let's look a little bit more in depth. What does it mean, change in input prices? So inputs are items used to create output. So ingredients would be another way of phrasing it for food items here. So input is a good used to produce another good. So for example, cheese and cheese pizza. So if the price of cheese goes up, then the supply is gonna decrease. Conversely, if the price of cheese goes down, then the supply increases. So if the price of an input increases, then that's bad for the supplier because you make less profit. If the price of cheese decreases, that's good because there's more profit potential. Okay. Now, change of technology generally works one way, but it theoretically could work the other way. there could be a decrease in technology. But for example, all the ways in which people can more easily turn inputs into useful goods, then that's going to be a change in technology. For example, an improved strain of corn resistant to diseases will increase the supply of corn. So the supply of corn is going to increase. Now, if for some reason Japan in Nagasaki and Hiroshima immediately after World War II, well, their technological state was very diminished, so there could have been a decrease in supply as a result. But for the most part, changes in technology implies there's a positive change, and that's going to increase the supply of a particular item. And we talked about this in changes in expectations. This can work both for supply and demand. So if expectations of a future price increase of items exist, then suppliers will tend to hoard the item in order to make more profit in the future. So let's say you have an item that you're selling and the price is $10. And let's say you have 100,000 of these items, roughly $100,000 of these items here. And you anticipate the price to increase to $15. And what's going to happen to your individual decision in order to sell that particular product? Well, the supply is going to decrease. You're going to tend to hoard it, right? You know there's going to be a price, you know the price is going to increase, so you're going to decrease the supply. It's almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy because you know that the price is going to increase, so you want to restrict that supply right now to try to sell it more in the future. Same thing, if you think that the price is going to drop, then you're going to increase the supply right now in order to capture the higher price. So it's almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy. So changes in expectations can actually change the demand and the supply curve simultaneously. So how would an increase in supply actually look like here? Again, very basic here. You have a supply curve, and then you would have a demand curve here. Now make sure you don't get lazy about this. One of the top points of advice that AP graders would tell students is to label. Do not leave graphs unlabeled because the reader will not necessarily assume you know exactly what you're talking about. And more practically for you, you're not going to get the points if you don't have the graphs properly labeled here. So you have Q1 right here and E1 here. So if there's a rightward shift or an increase in supply, then the equilibrium, which is the point here, this here is P1 here, equilibrium would increase in quantity. So from Q1 to Q2, but the price would decrease here. So the price here would decrease, but the quantity would increase. So if there's a rightward shift in supply, that's basically what happens. Now, if there's a decrease in supply, then you have the opposite function here. So you have quantity here and price, and then you have the demand. So you have D1, and let's call this E1 here, which is basically Q1, and P1 here. So if you have a leftward shift in the supply curve, you have the leftward shift, then you have S2, and you have Q2, and P2. So the price is going to increase and the quantity is going to decrease. So a leftward shift is going to cause a decrease in quantity, but the equilibrium price is going to increase. So supply, demand, and equilibrium. So I've been labeling the supply, demand, and I threw in the equilibrium here, but what does that actually mean here? Well, equilibrium simply means that it is the price that clears the market. So it's the intersection of supply and demand, and that's basically the equilibrium price. So the equilibrium quantity is the quantity of good bought and sold at the market clearing price. And so the equilibrium is where supply and demand curves are going to intersect here. So I kind of already introduced that when I drew the supply and demand curves, but I'm just going to talk about it a little bit more fully here. So if you have the price right here, or the dollar sign right here, and then you have the quantity, and you have a bunch of points here that are sloping upwards here, and this is supply. And then you have a downward sloping demand curve here. What this means is that the equilibrium is the point at which supply and demand equal each other. So this would be Q1 and then P1, and this is E1 here. So for example, if the price is going to be greater than the equilibrium price, you're going to basically have a situation where you have excess supply. So people are going to supply more than they're going to demand at that point here. Now, if you have the price below the equilibrium, then you're going to have a shortage because the sellers are going to sell out, and the quantity demanded is going to be greater than the quantity supplied. So the way that the market functions is that where supply and demand equals in this theoretical construct is that's where the equilibrium is, where supply and demand equal each other. So surplus and a shortage. So what is the difference between a surplus and a shortage? So I'll give you an example of how that would actually play out here. So a surplus is simply when the quantity supplied exceeds the quantity demanded, whereas a shortage is when the quantity demanded exceeds the quantity supplied. So we're going to go ahead and look at the supply and demand for pizza. And one case in which the price is a little bit too high, you have a bunch of excess pizza. And what happens when the price of the pizza is a little bit too low? So it's the supply and demand is going to look exactly the same. So I'll set these two problems up side by side here with price on the y-axis here, and on the x-axis you have quantity. Okay, and we'll do a supply to the sky here, and then you have demand. And so the equilibrium price is the intersection of supply and demand. So this is Q1, P1, and this is E1 here. And this is also Q1, and this is P1 here. So a surplus situation is when the quantity supplied exceeds the quantity demanded. So for example, let's say you are trying to charge P2 right here. What's going to happen is that the quantity supplied here, this is going to be the quantity supplied, and where the price intersects the demand curve, this is going to be the quantity demanded here. So the surplus would be the quantity supplied minus quantity demanded here. You're going to have a surplus of pizza. So hypothetically, let's say this price was $1 and you're trying to sell pizza at this $2 slice. Well, the market is gonna attack. They're not gonna like that $2 pizza slice. The market says it's only $1. So you're gonna have a surplus of QS minus QD. And basically, if you want to get back to equilibrium, the market solution is to lower the price. Now, what happens if you raise the price? If you raise the price, the surplus is just gonna increase, right? So there's a clear market solution on what to do with a surplus here. Now, a shortage situation works exactly pretty much in the same way. You have a market that's not in equilibrium. It's in disequilibrium here. So let's say you're trying to charge P2 here. Then clearly a lot of people are going to want to demand, or they're going to have a higher quantity demanded, but the supply, there's not incentive for pizza producers to enter the market. So you're going to have QS situation here. So the quantity demanded is going to exceed the quantity supplied. And so you have a shortage. So if you're trying to sell pizza at 25 cents and the market says to charge $1, or that's where the equilibrium is, there'll be tons of consumers that are happy, but you make the argument that this is not good for consumers because there's going to be a lot of happy consumers that ate pizza at that lower price, but there's a lot of people that never ate that pizza because suppliers simply didn't supply them. So this is another case of a market being in disequilibrium if the price is too low. So example number one, let's go ahead and simply, do a very a basic example of drawing a supply and demand graph with P1 as the equilibrium price and Q1 as the equilibrium quantity here. So again, no frills here. This is pretty basic in terms of what you're going to get here. So you get a downward sloping demand curve here, and put quantity and price, and then you have an upward sloping supply curve. That's it. Where supply and demand equal each other, that's going to be the equilibrium. And then this is going to be equilibrium quantity. And this is going to be equilibrium price. This is, again, really basic here, but it's surprising when you grade these AP exams, a lot of students will somehow look at this and say this is the demand curve. So that's something, if you're in this course, if you're taking the AP macro course, this has to be really second nature to you. The idea of upward sloping supply curve, downward sloping demand curve, intersection is the equilibrium. Okay, example number two. Let's say an individual by the name of C. Martin. His income increases for ice cream, which is a normal good. Graphically illustrate what happens to his demand for ice cream. So let's take a look graphically speaking. But before we graphically illustrate this, you get more money than what's going to happen to his demand for ice cream. Individually, the demand is going to increase here. So what we're doing is we're increasing the individual demand curve here. But this might not be the best example for a market demand because you're only dealing with one person here. But the concept is that if there's an increase in income for whatever reason, then the demand is going to increase, which leads to equilibrium price increase and an equilibrium quantity increase as well here. So here's a supply curve, the quantity, and the equilibrium is going to be right here. So this is Q1. And this is P1 here. So if there's an increase in the demand, what ends up happening is that there's an increase in the demand. So it shifts to the right. There's a rightward shift. So the new equilibrium is where the new demand curve and the old supply curve, which is also, I guess you can say the new supply curve because there's no change in supply. There's just a change in quantity supplied from this point to this point. So what ends up happening is that the equilibrium quantity has increased and the equilibrium price has increased here. So income increases, and from that you can extrapolate the idea that the equilibrium price is going to increase and the equilibrium quantity also increases as well. Okay, another example, show the difference between a change in quantity demanded for Blu-ray discs and a change in demand for Blu-ray discs. Okay, so I didn't really go over this very specifically, but again, this is something that you'll probably come across maybe one or two for multiple choice questions. Generally speaking, you're not going to see this type of question in a free response for macro. But it's something that is covered in usually the multiple choice section. With a question or maybe two. So for a demand curve here we'll just draw the demand curve for this here. So this is price here and quantity, and same thing here. You have the y-axis being price and the quantity being the x-axis here, and let's label this as D1 here. Now this is a change in quantity demanded for Blu-ray discs. So the market here for both of these guys is Blu-ray discs. So this is Blu-ray discs right here, and you have Blu-ray discs here. So a change in quantity demanded. So what does it mean, a change in quantity demanded? So let's say you have, this is P1 here, and Q1 here. So if you lower the price of a Blu-ray disc from, let's say, $20 to $15. So this is 20 P1, and let's say you lower it to $15. The key word here is ceteris paribus. So let's say you don't change anything else. What happens what happens to the quantity demanded? And the quantity demanded is going to increase from Q1 to Q2. So here, from point A to point B, this is a change in quantity demanded. So this is a change in quantity demanded, and so there's no change in demand. So notice the demand curve stayed exactly the same, but to move from point A to point B, the price change caused a change in quantity demanded. The demand curve itself didn't stay the same. Whereas if here, let's say that income increases in a community. So income increases in the community. Let's say the average income increases by $10,000 in the community. Then Blu-ray disc being a normal good, what's going to happen is that there's not going to be an increase in quantity demanded. So it's not the price change. It's basically at every single price level. So, at $3 or $4, there's going to be an increase in quantity demanded at every price point. So the real way of looking at this is demand curve is really composed of different points. So what ends up happening is that instead of at this price point, the quantity demanded is here. Instead of this price point, the quantity demanded increases here, and it increases here, and it increases here, and it increases here. And so when you plot the points, there's an increase in quantity demanded at every single point. So that's actually a change in demand. So this here is a change in demand. When something other than the price of the actual product changes, then there's an increase in demand. Here, there's merely a change in quantity demanded. So again, that's one of those things where it's good to know what causes a change in demand versus a change in quantity demand. Same thing applies to a change in quantity supplied versus a change in supply as well. So an example number 4 here. What we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and take a look at what happens if the equilibrium price of soda is $1. So graphically illustrate what will happen to the supply and demand graph for water if the price charged is 50 cents here. So let's say you have a situation here. So the equilibrium price of soda is $1. Graphically illustrate what will happen to supply and demand graph for water if the price charged is 50 cents here. Now let's go ahead and assume that the equilibrium price of water is also $1. So this is basically, this could be a setup for a question here. I know I only gave the equilibrium price of soda being $1. What happens if the price charge is 50 cents for water? So again, these are two different products here. So this is soda, and then this is H2O. This is water here. So what happens if you charge 50 cents here? But again, let's assume that it's $1 here. The reason why is, you can do a lot of different things if you change the price here. But let's go ahead and assume that the equilibrium is $1 for soda here. Q1. S1 here, and let's say this is Q1, and then let's label this $1. Let's say the equilibrium price for both soda and water is both $1. So what happens here if you charge 50 cents here? So you might think you're doing a favor here, but perhaps not. Perhaps the good thing to do would have been to raise the price. So what ends up happening here is that the quantity supplied is going to be fairly low right here. There's not a whole lot of area for profit, so suppliers don't enter the water selling industry here. Whereas the quantity demanded is going to be fairly high here. So you're going to have here a situation where there's an excess demand. You're going to have a surplus. So what's going to happen to supply and demand graph? So basically, if you have for some reason that 50 cents is the price that's charged, you're going to have a constant, not a surplus. You're going to have a shortage, right? So you're going to have the shortage situation. Now, eventually what's going to happen, the market's going to realize that there's a shortage situation. So as you're selling and selling out, suppliers are going to realize, what, we can raise the price. Okay. And demanders are going to realize that as they raise the price simultaneously, the quantity demanded is going to float back to this equilibrium again in the long run. The consumers and producers, the way you get rid of a shortage situation is that the price is going to rise. Now, who knows how long this would actually take, but this is the theory behind a surplus, a shortage situation here. The final example is, let's take a look at airline ticket prices. So let's say, hypothetically, that the equilibrium price of airline tickets from Los Angeles, California to London, England is $1,000. So graphically illustrate what will happen to supply and demand for London if an airline charges $1,500 for airfare from LAX to Heathrow, which is London's London Central Airport. So what's going to happen here? Again, you could draw the market supply and demand schedule, but it's easier just to put the price here and the quantity here, and you have an upward sloping supply curve, and then you have a downward sloping demand curve, and you label this as E1, and you put Q1 here and P1 here. So the P1 here happens to also be $1,500. And so the equilibrium, the equilibrium is not 1,500, it's 1,000. And then Q1 is unmentioned there. But what happens if an airline decides, we're going to charge $1,500. We just want to charge a higher price. We want to make more profit, right? Well, initially it sounds great. Sounds great to the supplier. Great, we're gonna be able to sell a whole lot more. But if that price is gonna be above the equilibrium, then you're gonna have a lot of unsold tickets. You're gonna have a lot of empty airplanes. The quantity supplied is gonna be fairly high, but the quantity demanded is gonna be fairly low. So this is the dilemma of airlines. They generally know where the equilibrium price is, but if they charge too high of a price, then you're going to have a situation where the QS is greater than the QD, and that situation is going to be a surplus. So what's going to happen? What's going to happen is that you're going to have this chronic surplus with that higher price. And how do you get back to the equilibrium? So just like in a shortage situation, both suppliers and demanders, they realize that the shortage situation, the only way to cure it is to raise the price. Conversely, the only way to cure a surplus situation and get back to the equilibrium is lower the price. You clear the market, and eventually it will get back to equilibrium. Again, absent any government intervention, the supply and demand model simply states that prices are just going to self-equilibrate, and the surplus in the long run is going to be adjusted, and you get back to the equilibrium price of $1,000. So thank you for watching Educator.com.